everyone who's made time this evening to have a look and see and listen at what I've been doing. My mum's, sorry, I just, just hold on one moment. Can you just bring it? Sorry. So, Roy mentioned the talk that I gave in 2012, and I have to confess that at the Natural History Museum, I actually had total stage fright. And I read my presentation, which is the worst presentation I've actually ever given. But I hope that this evening's one is an improvement on that. I wonder if it's possible to not see your the bar with the faces is actually blocking my view on the screen. Is it possible to move that at all? Oh, okay, hold on. Got it. I got it. Okay. So last year I was very lucky. I was asked to come and help out in the Overberg region of South Africa. It's in the very southern part of South Africa. And there's a non-profit organization called the Overberg Renosterveld Conservation Trust. And they asked me to come and do some field work for 3 months in the spring. And they also asked me to come and help them set up their herbarium. So I'm just going to share some of my experiences in the Overberg and just some, and also tell you a little bit what I've been doing in the years since I left England and SLBI. So for the last 5 years, I've actually been a volunteer with an organization known as CREW. That's an acronym for Custodians of Rare and Endangered Wildflowers. And it's a, as it says on the screen, it's a citizen science program that involves members of the South African community. And we go out every week and we survey, we look for plants, and we look for red listed plants in particular. And then we just record how many plants we see, we GPS them, and we record any threats that directly affect that population of plants. When I arrived back in South Africa, I have to confess that I hardly knew anything in the veld, and it's basically been a learning curve ever since. But it's been a fantastic experience. The CREW program is actually a collaboration between the South African National Biodiversity Institute and the Botanical Society of South Africa. And I'm not going to say much more about that, but the program's been going since 2003, and it's nationwide across South Africa with clusters, obviously where we have the more threatened, where we have plant communities with more threatened species. The Botanical Society of South Africa is on YouTube, and there's a very good presentation called South Africa's Plant Extinction Crisis. And there's a case study in this program, and this is one of the sites that we regularly visit. And I've actually seen the last 3 remaining plants that Jacques talks about in the video. But you're welcome to go and have a look at that later. So this is the CREW group that I normally go out with. This is just various shots from various points in time, and you can see in the 3 pictures I chose, we just happen to be on a mountain each time. But actually, we spend most of our time in the lowlands, and being high up on a mountain is really an exception. But these are the lovely people. They've not replaced the lovely people of the SLBI, but they've become my new botanical family. And they're really lovely people, and I enjoy working with them. So I can highly recommend joining a CREW group if you're ever able to come to South Africa. So as I mentioned, South Africa faces a plant extinction crisis, and 16% of South Africa's plants are actually threatened with extinction. These are not, there's obviously all the other plants that are also of conservation concern. And in total, a quarter of South African plants are endangered in some way. So the drivers of extinction that I encounter through the work that we've been doing with CREW are marked with number 1. So it's invasive plant species and also urban development. I live on the northern part of Cape Town, and it's really the only part of this big city where expansion can still occur. Unfortunately, there's several vegetation types that are threatened, and so these are the factors that we see here. We're in Cape Town. When I went to the Overberg, I experienced the threat of crop cultivation and of habitat degradation. On a lot of the sites that we visited, there was a lot of overgrazing, and the overgrazing leads to soil erosion. And I've never experienced soil erosion to this extent. Quite often, well, obviously with soil erosion, all the soil disappears. You have plants covering the landscape, but there's no soil for seeds to germinate or to keep to get young seedlings going. So it's really something that was unexpected, but quite significant in that landscape. In South Africa, we also have medicinal plant harvesting. A large majority of South African people can't afford Western medicine and rely on traditional medicine. And then there is also a very active, unfortunately, illegal succulent plant trade. Succulents are favored as the new toys in certain parts of the world. And there's been a lot of changes in the red list status of some succulents because of this. So South Africa is rather unique in that it's already assessed all the plants that occur in the country, and they've assessed them against a number of criteria, and this allows them to determine what the red list status of a plant is. Now I've chosen one here called aloe ferox, and it's related to aloe vera, which people use on their skin, for example. And on the red list website, it tells you all sorts of information about this particular plant. So quite often there'll be a map with its distribution range, as you can see on the right-hand side. It also gives synonyms and then also common names. In South Africa, we have 11 official languages. And so the common names are really problematic for a number of very obvious reasons. And then, so further down, about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see it says national status, least concern. It'll tell you when it was assessed and the people that assessed it. As you scroll down the page, which I'm not going to do now, it'll tell you what the factors are that threaten the species, what sort of vegetation type veld vegetation occurs in, all sorts of other bits of information, which is really helpful. So this is the site I use very often. This is the aloe ferox that I've just mentioned. It's of least concern and does occur in the eastern parts of the Renosterveld. It's literally the tallest plant that you're going to get in the Renosterveld, and it ranges from about 2 to 3 meters in height. Sometimes less, sometimes more. So the red list puts the plants in a number of categories. So 75% of plants which are not threatened in any way are then classified as least concern. So they're at the bottom of the screen at the least concern LC. If your plant has gone extinct, it's going to be in one of the grey categories. The red ones are the threatened species, and the orange ones are species of conservation. Well, they're all species of conservation concern, apart from the least concern. And so we work with these categories, and we have to understand these categories now in what we do. So once we've GPS the red list species that we found, and we've identified them properly, we can either identify them properly or we put them onto iNaturalist, the platform, and experts might identify it for us, or if we know what it is, we'll do it. And then we submit it to the Red Data Project, or the Red List Project, I should say. And then from there on, the information is collated. And then over time, people will assess all the information that's been submitted, and they'll determine which red list category it needs to go into. So in the UK, you can also use the iNaturalist platform. This is just a screenshot from last year's City Nature Challenge. And there's I think it's the end of April, beginning of May. There's a weekend where you can go out and use your smartphone or just a normal camera and take pictures and upload them to the website. So this is what we use to submit our data. So I thought I would just this is really basic, but how to pronounce the word Renosterveld. So it's Ren, as in the Navy Ren, Ost, as in Ostend in Europe, on the side of caution, and felt you use in crafting. So it's Renosterveld. And I think it's important that people can say this word, because if you can say it, and if you can understand something, then you can learn to appreciate it, and then you can learn to conserve it. So I want to show you a short little clip because everything I'm going to show you today is very visual. But I just wanted to show you something to just give you a bit of sound and a bit of movement in the felt. So I hope you can see this. Okay. Whoops. Okay, so I've just mentioned that we redlist plants and sort of the redlist process for plants. But something that a lot of people don't know about, and which I didn't really know about until I came back to South Africa, was that there is actually a system in place to assess vegetation types. And there is also a set of criteria against which vegetation types are measured. And then in the same way that plants can be threatened by urbanization or invasive plants, so a vegetation type can actually be threatened in the same way. And so obviously the vegetation types are highly dependent on the geology and the climate in a particular area. And what you find, for example, in the Cape Peninsula, where I'm from, is that there are a lot of varied geologies and lots of different sort of microclimates and niches. And then you have very particular suites of or groups of plants that occur together. And so it's not like the savanna where you have long stretches of monotonous vegetation. Here, the vegetation varies quite a lot over a very short distance. And it's for this reason that people talk about the plant, the fynbos plant kingdom, because there's such a huge diversity of ecological niches, and it's resulted in huge variation in species and plant species, I should say. So there's a lot of vegetation types within the city of Cape Town, for example, and obviously they're threatened. So all the vegetation types that that we work on here in Cape Town are all threatened. They're either critically endangered or vulnerable. And unfortunately, the same is also true of the Renosterveld. And I'm just going to show you a few things about this. Oh yes, so all the Renosterveld vegetation types in the Overberg are actually critically endangered. This means that it's one step below extinct. So I hope you can appreciate the significance of all of this. So, whoopsie, I don't know what's happening there. Here is an assessment, just as I showed you the redlist website. Here's just an extract from one of the vegetation types that I've worked in, and it gives all sorts of the same types of detail and information. But I don't know if you can see right in the middle of the page, it says known number of species of special concern, and there's 49 red dates of plant species, and there's 15 endemic species, just in this one particular type of Renosterveld. This information is quite old. It dates from 2009. So I can tell you that number will be considerably higher, and the number of endemic species must be at least 2 to 3 times higher by now. So so the Renosterveld, where I worked last year, in 2019, 14% of it remained, and last year they'd record they think that there was about 5% left. So there's considerable. The threats are very real to these vegetation types. So this is the charity that I went to work for last year. They're the Overberg Renosterveld Conservation Trust. It's a bit of a mouthful, but they're the ones who asked me to come do the field surveys to work in the herbarium. So they've actually pioneered something really quite special. A part of it is stewardship in the traditional sense, but then they're also using another element which I've never even heard of before. Maybe other people have. But the first part, which is the stewardship element of it, we also see, for example, in Cape Town, where the city of Cape Town joins up with landowners to develop a management plan for the site. But in the Renosterveld, they also do this, the Overberg Trust. They also go into partnership with landowners, and in this case, all the Renosterveld occurs on farmland or on farms, and they develop a management plan, and they will help farmers, for example, fence their property, fence the Renosterveld. If the farmer also has sheep on his property, they will help with watercourse restoration. They will help with the fires, because many of these Renosterveld areas are actually fragments, and the ecological function of fire, which is quite as important in the fynbos, it's also important in the Renosterveld. And because of these fragments, they don't experience fire, and landowners are generally not very willing to set fire to a Renosterveld fragment, which is right next door to a huge wheat field, for example. So they do all sorts of management elements, and obviously they do education and all sorts of other things. But now the part that really sets this charity apart and this sort of new idea that they have is in exchange, because what the charity does is it does all these things for the farmer, but it pays the charity pays to do this work. So it doesn't cost the farmer anything, and that's fantastic for the farmer. But what they require is that the farmer willingly places a restriction on the title deed of the property. And it means that that land, which has been designated as Renosterveld and has been GPSed and set it perfectly resolved, in theory, no one can ever develop that land and must manage it to conserve the Renosterveld. So it's basically trying to preserve the Renosterveld for perpetuity. And it means that even if the farmer sells his property, that in theory the Renosterveld remains protected. Now it's quite a mind shift or a paradigm shift for people, and I think that it's incredibly brave thing for many people to do, for farmers to do. But it has to be done, because the only place that the Renosterveld still exists is on the land of farmers. And I'll show you a few maps just to show you what's going on. So these are the two people I joined last year. On the right is Grant Forbes, is the extension officer, and then on the right hand side is Dr. Odette Curtis. This whole story was her idea, and she's actually an ornithologist, but we'll talk a bit about that later. But it was great fun going out with them in the park. So this is a scene that many people at the SLBI will recognize. These are volunteers actually who are preparing herbarium specimens, and the volunteer in the middle was not told that she wasn't allowed to lift up her specimen and hold it in that position. Never mind. But the volunteers came for 2 weeks and mounted lots of specimens. They don't glue, they tape. and we're just helping to create the herbarium. Oh, this is inside the research center at Wildflowers. So this is where I actually stayed for the 3 months. It's a house on a nature reserve called Wildflowers, and the entire site is managed by the trust, but it's actually owned by WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. And it's basically a research center and a base for people who need to work in the Renosterveld. So it's all sorts of people. It's not just academics, people who need to change camera trap batteries, people researching mosses, lots of bird people are in the area as well. So this was the lovely house I stayed in. This was the view out the front door every morning. Well, this is actually at sunset. This picture is this is actually the moon on the top left hand side, but it was absolutely a picturesque landscape, stunning place really. The house in the research center is actually on one segment of the reserve, but it just happens to be the segment that's almost surrounded by agriculture, and the entire landscape is really a landscape of agriculture. This is the view out the back door, which is quite nice. And I got to see lots of interesting agricultural things as well. And it was the lambs had come and they were shearing the sheep and all sorts of things were happening. I don't know if you can see the guy's trousers. He's got the lanolin from the oil from the wool on his has rubbed off onto his trousers. So yeah, Caroline. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask. There's some green marks on the page. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, I was just wondering about those actually.
Yeah, I thought they were on your screen probably.
Yeah, I've only noticed it the last few slides.
Okay, I don't know what it is.
It doesn't track. But Petra, do you think you could speak up a little bit? It would be helpful for me, at least.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try. I'll project.
More. Thank you.
I can't see myself, so okay. So the Renosterveld is actually a part of the Greater Cape Floristic region. So when people talk about the Greater Cape Floristic region, they're talking about the fynbos, which people are most familiar with. They're talking about the Renosterveld, which is where I worked last year. They're talking about the Strandveld, which is along the coast, and then the forest and the thicket. Those are more towards the east, and also in the kloofs, which, well, the ravines which occur. So how do you tell the Renosterveld and the fynbos apart and the Strandveld apart, really? And it's actually got to do with the geology and then the vegetation, the geology and the climate. So the fynbos occurs on sandstone, and the sandstone, the mountains around the Cape are generally sandstone, well, mostly sandstone, and the soil is acidic and extremely nutrient poor. The sand near the sea is obviously of marine origin, so it tends to be alkaline or neutral, and there's often bits of shell in it, and in that you get the Strandveld vegetation. And then you have the shale and the granite and the siltcrete derived soils, which is where the Renosterveld occurs. And this is in the valleys. This occurs in the valleys between the sandstone mountains. And the soil is extremely, extremely rich. And it means that it's perfect soil for the growing of crops, and mostly wheat in this case. So different geologies have resulted in totally different vegetation types, and has had significant impact on how things have been protected or how they've been threatened. So one of the things that you can see here on this map are the green areas, and they're actually nature reserves, but if you look carefully, you can see that it's actually on all these nature reserves are on mountains, long mountain ranges that we get in the Western Cape, and then also one or two places where there are estuaries. And then on the next slide, I hope you can see that there are two areas where the screen is slightly yellowish. Now the yellow actually represents wheat farming areas. And so there's two main areas of wheat farming. You have the wheat farming in the south, which is the Overberg, which is the region that I explored. And then on the west coast, we have the Swartland. And that's the area that I normally explore with my crew group away, not last year. So I'll be talking about the southern section where the yellow is. And that's the boundary of the Renosterveld. And you can see it very nicely misses all the nature reserves. And obviously this entire, except for one small area, and this entire area is farmed with grains. I don't know if you can see just above the red shape, you can see some purple dots on the screen. Those are actually areas where South Africa's fruit, a lot of South Africa's fruit is grown, apples, pears, apricots, all sorts of things. And then you'll see and grapes as well. So occupying totally different types of landscapes. Soil types. And then, okay, so this was one of my regular drives. It was an hour's drive. It took an hour's drive to the nearest shop, although it was only 35 kilometers away. And this was the straightest, smoothest part of the journey. Here, I wanted to put this in because I wanted to show you that it wasn't all lovely weather the whole time. You can see the snow on the mountains in the background there. And it's a very cold wind that blows at Haverskloof in the winter, I can tell you that. But what you can also see in the foreground is the yellow crops. That's rapeseed or canola. This is areas, a lot of planting of that. But you can also see the undulating landscape, and you can also see some veld and some other crops being grown. Here it's the same story. This was quite early on in my visit, and you can see the fog in the bottom of the valleys. Now this is a typical Renosterveld landscape. Finally, you get to see some Renosterveld after how many minutes? But this is a picture taken from Haverskloof, and you can see the wheat fields further away. So there's quite a bit of slope here, and although you can't see it, there's quite a bit of quartz on the top of the surface here. So this is another picture taken more or less from the same spot, and you can see the Renosterveld here is quite low. It's because of the quartz substrate, and you can see that there's some people for scale. But there's the most astonishing range of little hills, and I think of them more as the dragons on the scales on a dragon's back, or the spine of a dragon's back. Very interesting. Makes for spectacular sunsets, by the way. So here is another picture of the Renosterveld, and what you'll see is throughout the pictures that I'm going to show you is that the Renosterveld tends to occur on particular sites within the Overberg. So one of the first things that I really realized after I spent quite a few weeks in the Renosterveld was that after all that time, I still didn't know what the Renosterveld. If someone asked me, what does the Renosterveld look like? I still couldn't really tell them. And the reason for that is that huge proportions of the Overberg are flat. And on the flat portions, there's only wheat. And the Renosterveld that remains is only on these very steep slopes of mountains or hills, and mostly along river courses where people can't actually farm. So, and quite often these areas also have rather complex geology. So you have rocky outcrops of all sorts of things, all sorts of elements. So obviously the vegetation in these areas is going to be different to the vegetation that you're going to get on the flat areas. The most significant thing that you notice when you're in the Renosterveld is that the vegetation that's on the north side of the slope is significantly different, and it's much drier because it's actually facing the equator where the sun is. Obviously, we're in the on the other side of the world here. And then the south facing slope in the shade has a much denser vegetation. So even within 25 meters, the vegetation changes remarkably. And so when I describe the vegetation of the Renosterveld, I'm actually describing a vegetation of these sides of very steep hills or mountains, or in the ravines. Not really the Renosterveld, because the wide open flat stretches that occurred. Here again, you can see a river course with the Renosterveld vegetation on it. And here's another view. You can see the trees at the bottom there where it's a little bit more moist. And a lot of those trees that you can actually see are a species of Buddleia, which is indigenous to South Africa and not from China, but it's covered in a white mass. And it actually really reminded me of walking in the English countryside when you come across alder and that heavy scent that you get in the late summer. So I was actually taken back to England for a moment there. So this is another watercourse. It's a degraded system on the banks because there's been overgrazing in the past. But this is actually a site that's undergone a lot of restoration work, and the water was of very good quality, and I was quite amazed to see it. It was quite impressive, to be honest. But again, you can see it's a very flat landscape, and other farmers who are not in the conservation program would probably have plowed as close to that point as they could. So here's another example of one of the biggest rivers in the region, in the eastern part, and you can actually see the aloes in the sort of halfway across the screen. The soil is, and you can see the farm, the cultivated land on the tops of the hills. Sometimes we were able to access really amazing places that are really not accessible to the normal public, and this was just a spectacular site that we visited. So I just wanted, now we actually get onto the plants of the Renosterveld, and I've kind of divided them a little bit into their structural units. So the geophytes, they're actually the bulbs. Graminoids are the things that look like grasses, and then you get herbs and low shrubs, and then you get parasitic or semi-parasitic shrubs, succulent herbs, succulent shrubs, succulent trees. The only succulent tree actually is the aloe ferox, which I showed you earlier, and then taller shrubs. But I'll show you some of these. I'm just going to go back one slide. And these are some of the plant families. So I'm only going to show you some of them, but you may recognize a few of them. Oxalidaceae, Oxalis, Hoaceae, Apiaceae, Asteraceae, Fabaceae, you'll recognize. Azuaceae, those are all a lot of the succulents that we get. Crassulas, many houseplants are in the Crassula family. Yeah, so I'm just going to run you through a selection of images, lots of pretty plant pictures, and then I must, yeah. So this is one of the graminoids. It's in the family Cyperaceae. When I first came across this one, it didn't have any fertility, and I had no idea what it was. It was just very curious looking, and it's very atypical actually of the Cyperaceae that we get generally in this region. So what I've done is I've put the botanical, the Latin name, followed by the family name, and then I've generally included its red list status. So this is a very small plant. It's about 5 centimeters tall, and it likes to grow on the quartz substrate of the Renosterveld. And it's just always this, the whole time I was there, it was this luxurious green color, just really striking, and tiny, very tiny and dainty. It's near threatened and it's endemic, which means that it only occurs on the quartz outcrops within the Renosterveld. This is another grass species, and it doesn't look like very much, but it's about a meter tall, meter plus tall, and it's called Wildflower. And when you see the species in abundance, you know that there's been overgrazing. So the plants can tell us a little bit about the history of the veld that we're walking in. This is another species, and this is a species that would have grown on the large flat areas which are now occupied by the crops. This is a very palatable grass species, and they're always trying to introduce this when they're doing restoration work. But we didn't see it that we saw it, but not that often. So I've just shown you poor overgrazing, and this one's for good grazing. Then one of the other families or groups in the graminoids are the restios, and they're not something that people in Europe are really familiar with, but they look like grass basically. And this one is called Elegia. It's near threatened, but it's a really, really very pretty plant. Again, it's growing on this quartz substrate that you get. Then this is an osteospermum. Lots of people will be familiar with osteospermum in the horticultural trade, but this is one that also grows on the quartz, and it's got lovely gray velvety leaves which help it to overcome the summer temperatures which occur in that region, which are very high and on the quartz. So okay, so we have a lot of asparagus species. Now, people think of asparagus as something that you eat, but there are a large number of asparagus species in the Renosterveld and in the Fynbos actually as well. And it just means that when you're walking in the veld, they always have, and these species always have, well, 90% of the time they have really vicious thorns. So you're always looking out for them and looking to avoid them. This one grows in a lollipop shape. You can actually see the shadow on the ground. It's quite an easy one to ID. So this is a picture. This is a shrub, and it's actually a picture of Renosterveld, of the Renosterbos of the Renosterveld. So this is the main shrub that's associated with this vegetation type, and it's an Elytropappus, and it's in the Asteraceae family. So one of the things that people sometimes wonder about is why is it called Renosterveld? And Renoster means rhino, and some people think that it got this name because the rhino is the same color, or the bushes are the same color. But I have actually seen rhinos in the Renosterveld, and what happens is that they like to roll in the sand to keep the insects at bay. So, and the sand in the Renosterveld is generally bright red, it's red or orangey. So what happens is you actually have a rhino walking around that's orange color. So I don't think I'm personally of the opinion that it's not because they're the same color as the Renosterveld. But when you read the early accounts of the explorers of the region and for a very long time, they were always right about how they came across rhinos in this landscape. So I think it was probably that they associated this type of landscape with the rhinos, just an encountering them rather than the color. That's my opinion. So this is the Renosterbos up close, and you could see it's got incredibly tiny leaves, and they're actually adpressed, or they're actually right up against the stem. And then what I did was I found one in flower, and it's in the family Asteraceae. And if you remember, it's in the daisy family, and most daisies have lots of ray petals and disc florets, ray florets and disc florets, and there's a lot of flowers. But in this case, there's only 3 three flowers that are enclosed by the bracts, which you can see here. So one of these heads, small little heads, is the equivalent of a big daisy flower, if you can think of it like that. Okay, so here's another species. It's called Euclidium. It's a very low growing shrub, herb, right on the ground, very small. Although the flowers themselves are about three centimeters in diameter, this flower head that you see on the right. Again, it's a daisy, but in this case, it's got, I think, about 10 flowers on it. But it's really very, very pretty. This is one of the larger shrubs that you get in the Renosterveld, also in the daisy family. And here it is. You can see it in the context of the landscape. And this is at Harbaskloof again. And here's another species called Teronia. The P is silent. And here you can, on the right-hand side, you can again see the individual flowers in the flower head. This species, though, is generally associated with a disturbed landscape. And then we move on to the ericas. Hey. And not too many of them, though, but there are a few, quite difficult to name. And this is a very small one. So these flowers were probably 4 millimeters in length. And quite often what you'll find in this landscape, I don't know if you can see what look like little satellite dishes that are extended from the flower. That's actually the stigma and the style. And what happens quite often in this landscape is that becomes quite enlarged. And so you have a very large stigma, and it actually catches the pollen by wind pollination. There's wind pollination occurs. So, and then this is a very lovely, lovely erica as well. When I found it, I was very, very excited, and I jumped up and down, and I thought I found something really special. But it turned out not to be that special because it's least concerned in terms of red list status. But it's just such a regal plant. There's something very noble about it. And I've written in the bottom of the screen, you'll see I've said Erica ricavata, because I thought that's what I'd found, but I was mistaken. And this is the Erica ricavata is something that was only known from a drawing from the early 1800s, and they only refound it in 2007. So anyway, keeping our eyes peeled. This is another Erica species. This one we saw quite a few times. The individual flowers here are about 4 centimeters in length. So it's really a showy plant. But what's also really interesting is the way that the leaves are arranged. They look like fireworks along the stem. So it's quite easy to recognize, but again, very pretty in the landscape. This is also one of the plants that I saw quite a lot of, typically about 50 to 75 centimeters in height or tall. The color that you see here is the true color, and it attracts lots of insects. So this one is again in the Fabaceae family. It's in the pea family. It's called the Spalathus quartzicola, and it lives in the quartz. So these little white flowers, it almost flows seamlessly into the quartz patch behind. But it's red listed as vulnerable, and it only occurs on these quartz outcrops. The stems and branches are very thick, and they look to be extremely old, but I don't think there's any way of ever being able to determine how old they are. But just really exciting to see this, and I think one of my highlights on the trip. So I've included this one. This one is a much taller shrub in the landscape. I would say about 1.5 meters in height. Let me just show you here. Very pretty, but it's in the pea family Fabaceae. But the reason why I wanted to mention it is because it's named after Roger Colhill, who was a botanist at Kew. and after Charles Sturton, who was the South African Botanical Liaison Officer at Kew for quite a long time ago. But he's still a very active botanist within South Africa, and he has quite a few PhD students as well. PhD. So here it is in the landscape. And then this is another species that grows in the Renosterveld. It's called the Hermania, and it's in the Malvaceae, which is the cotton family, but it's a very large family. And the common name for this one is Dole's rose, because it literally looks like a little rose. But what I should say about this little plant is that each flower is about maximum a centimeter across, 1 centimeter in diameter. So it's very small and it's normally nodding. But this species, this group, the Hermanias, we found at almost very common, and it was very common, especially at sites where there'd been a fire. Here's a yellow one. The taxonomy of the Hermanias is undergoing quite a bit of research, and there'll be quite a lot of new species described at some point in time. But what I wanted to show you really was this site where there'd been a fire. And most of the color in this picture is actually provided by those little Dole's roses I've just shown you, and then also by that Osteospermum, the yellow daisy I showed you earlier. And then some of the red is an Indigofera, a pea as well, which I haven't shown you. But most of the color here is actually from the Hermania. And then I wanted to show you this one. We're at the Rutaceae now. We're heading towards the end of the list. This is the Diosma, and it's in the same family as Rutaceae is the same family as the citrus plant, so oranges and lemons and whatever. And when you squeeze the flesh, you get lots of oils come out, and it's very aromatic. Now these plants are exactly the same, and they're if you brush against the leaves or you squeeze them or whatever, crush them, you get a very intense fragrance, and it differs from species to species. And so some people can actually tell the different species apart by the smell. And it's a very important plant in South African traditional cultures. People make teas from it and ointments and all sorts of things. And locally it's known as buchu, but there's actually a huge number of species. So when people use that term, it's like saying, oh, it was a rose. You know, it's a common name for a lot of species. But very interesting plants as well. This is another one that's common in horticulture, is Coluniema. It's also in the Rutaceae, but this one doesn't actually smell. It's the exception rather than the rule. And here it is in the landscape. So it generally blends in, but when you look up close, it's much more interesting. And then this is one of the taller shrubs in the landscape. This is about 1.5 meters. It's in the Scrofulariaceae. But it's this beautiful, beautiful blue. It goes, it can be much darker blue, and it can also go to white. Different species though. But I also jumped up and down when I saw this one for the first time. It's really lovely. So I wanted to show this one because there's a strong English connection here. It's called James Britannia. And James Britton was the editor of the Journal of Botany in the UK for 45 years. And yeah, so there's lots of plants that have got English connections as well. But this one's really a lovely, lovely plant. This is another James Britannia. It's near threatened, and although it says calcifilla, it also occurs in the Renosterveld. This is a white one. And then there's this one, which is a hybrid. This was a hybrid we found in the veld. Pretty little things that you come across. And this is one of the parasitic plants that you get in the Renosterveld. Well, actually, you get them all over the famous as well. They parasitize on a number of plants, quite often Asteraceae or Fabaceae. And they can actually parasitize on the whole series of different plants at the same time. The plant itself is about 5 centimeters tall, or the length of one of those flowers would be about 3 to 4 centimeters. So it's not it's not small, and it's quite sturdy. And I've often quite wondered about the pollinators. I was rather curious as to why a parasitic plant would feel the need to produce flowers. But I suppose if a fire came through and destroyed the hosts, that it would at least have an opportunity to set seed and grow. But it's lots of unanswered questions and things to find out in the future. Now, this is the second last group of plants I'm going to just mention. This group are the bulbs. Now, they're really an important part of the Renosterveld, and it's kind of one of those groups that really sets it apart. This vegetation group apart from the others. There's just an extraordinary number of bulbs. So I'm just going to show you a few. This is an arostea. It's very bright blue in the landscape. The color's a bit poor here. This is a Bobiana, and it's this incredible buttery yellow color. This is what's called a Bobatia. It's near threatened. And on the right-hand side, the brown is actually where the flowers have died, and it's setting seed. But you'll see that it actually looks like a grass. It's got graminoid tendencies. So it's trying to look like a grass in this environment. It's probably to keep the developing seed heads as far away from the surface, and the surface, very high surface temperatures. But this is a bulb that very unusual. But what I do want to say about this group is when you get it en masse, it can also be a sign of poor veld management and overgrazing. So this is a gladiolus called alatus. This is one we also find in not only in the Overberg but also in the Swartland, and it's of least concern. But that flower that you see there is probably about 5 to 7 centimeters in length, and you'll just get this one flower at a time or a few. But it's quite a large flower. It's not something that it's not small. This is a gladiolus, not threatened. If you view it from the side, so I haven't really, one of the flowers you can see. You can actually see through the middle of the plant, and there's actually a little window has been created. I don't know what the purpose of that is, but I think the name permeabilis probably means you can see through it, and is related to that. But probably about 50 centimeters high, this plant tall. This is another gladiolus, and also a fairly large flower, but it's got these incredible markings on the petals or sepals, and it's probably saying to the insects, you've got to stop here. You've got to put your landing gear out. This is where you've got to come and stop. And then this is one of my favorite. It's called a Laperousia. The flowers come out at angles. So the bracts which occur at the bottom, each one is a few degrees different. It comes out in a sort of a spiral. So when you look at it from the side, it looks like a pyramid. Hence the pyramididalis in its species specific epithet. This is a near threatened species of Morea, and this one's about 10 centimeters tall, and that flower's about 2 centimeters in diameter. Just another one of the many lovelies in the veld. I came across this one on my second day in the veld. It's the only time, or I only saw it twice in the veld. It's an endangered species, but the color is true. So this is what it looks like in the veld. very striking. And then this is another Morea, also quite small, 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter, but it's got these very unusual flower parts. If you look closely, you can see all sorts of things happening. If it's bright and gaudy, I like to look at. Here's something very orange. It's a Tritonia. It grows in the Renosterveld. It's least concerned. But that one's one of the things I want to say about the bulbs is that a lot of the bulbs occur in quite rocky areas. There's a lot of predation from creatures like porcupines, and they will dig a lot of holes. All sorts of small mammals will dig for bulbs and things. So quite often in rocky areas you'll find these things. This is Watsonia that we saw on one of our trips onto the lower slopes of mountains. Another Watsonia. This was growing at Hartwegskloot. Not too many of them, but still very pretty. And then I came across this one. It's called Eucomus. That's in the family Hyacinthaceae. And I was very excited to see this one in the Renosterveld because I didn't realize that they grew this far west in the Cape. I thought that they grew much further east. The ones in the east are much taller. So this flower head that you can see, it's about 10, 15, maximum 15 centimeters tall. And those leaves are about 45 centimeters across. So it's quite succulent as well. So, but I was very excited to see this one. I felt very privileged to see it actually. So this is another succulent plant that I haven't shown the leaves in this instance, but these are the flowers, and they really remind me of the head of a flamingo. And the color is just fantastic. Okay, so this is the last group of flowers that I'm going to show you. These are the what they call the fagies in South Africa, the Azoaceae or the mesems, the old mesems. There's lots of chrysanthemum in the landscape. Lots of these plants are red listed, but they have spectacular flowers. So I'll just run you through some of them. This is this is flavum. That is the color that you see it in the veld. Lots of hispidum, very common. Not so common, endangered actually, but that color is true. They're very vivid. This plant was actually growing next to the road. So every time I went to town to do my shopping, I went past this one, and this one actually glistens in the light. Just really fantastic one. And then we encountered this one. This is a gibeum. Gibeum actually, or gibbous, means a hump. So if you look at these leaves, which are very succulent, they look almost identical to the stones around them, and they probably look like a hump. But very pretty little things. And this was on my wish list of plants to see, or that really hack-eyed expression, my bucket list. But I really wanted to see these in flower. So I just wanted to say that this pavement of quartz, it's rock solid hard. You can't see any soil, and it's very difficult to actually extract one of these pebble or stones out of the pavement. This one is another species, very, very pretty, but the flower is almost matte. So whereas the previous plants glistened in the sun, this one is so matte and cream color. It comes across as being very soft or smooth. And then it has these bright green leaves. And in the bottom right-hand side, you can see some of the leaves have got a little tassel of hair at the end of the tip of the leaf, but I don't know if you can see it on this screen. So that's the plants finished. Just 4 slides left. But what I wanted to say is that this entire landscape, which is threatened by agriculture and by overgrazing, is also the home of a whole number of not of fauna. And this was the cover of a popular agricultural magazine in South Africa. And they've got on their cover a black harrier, which is an endangered species of bird in South Africa. And this is actually the bird that Odette Curtis, who's the director of the Overberg Trust, she got her PhD studying this bird. The Landbouweekblad often carries stories about conservation. And they'd done an article about how the farmers are the great partners of conservation in the Renosterveld, and they put the black harrier on the cover. So the Renosterveld in the Overberg is also the home of a colony of Cape vultures. Cape vultures are an endangered species, and it's the only population of Cape vultures that is not in decline. All the other populations around the country are in decline. The one in the Cape is doing well. I also saw secretary birds. They're vulnerable. Marshall eagles, endangered, and then lots of blue cranes. Now, the blue cranes didn't originally occur in the landscape, but because of agricultural practices, there was a change in their distribution range, and it's got to do with farming practices. But the original distribution areas of distribution are highly threatened, and so the larger populations actually now exist in new areas that they've colonized. So this is roadkill, and we saw quite a lot of dead animals on the road. This is an aardwolf, and it's the smallest of the hyena predators that you get in the landscape. We don't get hyenas in the Overberg, I should say, but this is a nocturnal animal that actually feeds on termites, and it's actually least concerned because it occurs across southern Africa, but it's very unusual to see it in the Overberg, and sadly we actually saw this dead one. This is it's not a puppy. This is the size of this animal. I mean, it's not a young animal. It's an adult. And then there's this antelope which occurs in the Overberg. It's called a bontebok, or a pied antelope, as my mom pointed out to me. And it only occurs in the Overberg, and it's red listed as vulnerable. In the 1950s and 60s, there were only 11 of these animals left. And so the entire population that we have today stems from those original 11 animals. And my mum was telling me earlier today that when she was a child at school in the 1950s that there was always something in the newspaper about the bontebok, because the bontebok were brought to the nature reserve, which was near my mum's town, Swellendam, where she grew up. But the males are very aggressive, and they kill other males. So they're trying to move some of the bontebok out of the big national parks, the 2 parks where they do occur, because the populations are increasing. But there's actually very little Renosterveld left, and these antelope won't live in the Renosterveld that's on the sides of mountains or in the river systems. They need the wide, flat, open spaces. So what they're going to do is buy farmland and then use that as part of the conservation of the species, because there's just no vegetation, flat vegetated areas left for them. And this is almost my last slide. This is almost my last slide. Quite often when I was walking in the veld, I would hear I would hear these antelope calling, and it's literally the sound of a cat with a fur ball. But when you look up to try to catch a glimpse of them, you literally see their tails. They go over a ridge nearby. But this lot, I was actually downwind of them, which is the only reason why I managed to get this picture on the left-hand side. And then one day I was walking in the veld, and I actually just came upon this little one. Obviously, I was walking with my camera in my hand, so I took a very quick picture and then moved away. But this little antelope was lying perfectly still, and only his eyes were moving, his eyelids were moving. So just a little special moment in the veld. And then that's the end of my presentation. And now it's time for questions. And I think it's been much longer than the allotted time, but anyway. Okay, back to you, Caroline and Roy and Nell.